Gospel of John, chapter 11, verses 32 to 44. There we go. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Jesus, once more, deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across its entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days." Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me. But I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen, and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." So, can't find my place. There's a great writer that I really like. His name is Frederick Buechner. I don't know if you all know him. He was a pastor, a Presbyterian pastor, but he was a great writer. Only died a couple of years ago, but he wrote about his love for certain deceased people in his life who had impacted his life. And he talked a little bit about All Saints' Day as well. And this is what he said. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'll read enough of it. "Even the ones I did not all that much like, I think I knew I would miss when the time came. I sensed in them, as I sensed in myself, an inner battle against loneliness and the great dark, and to know that they were also battling was to be no longer alone in the same way within myself. I loved them for that. I wished them well. And then there was Jimmy, my first fast friend, and Hyler, who of all of them heard out most healingly the secret of my father, and Billy, skinny and full of life and the brightest of us all, who would have added God only knows how much richness to the great ragbag of things if the war had not ended him before he more than got started. I could not imagine who I would have been without them. Nor can I imagine it to this day, because they are in so many ways a part of me still. All Saints' Day, it is not, on All Saints' Day, it is not just the saints of the church that we should remember in our prayers, but all the foolish ones and wise ones, the shy ones and the overbearing ones, the broken ones and the whole ones, the despots and the tosspots and the crackpots of our lives, who one way or another have been our particular fathers and mothers and saints, in whom we loved without knowing we loved them, and by whom we were helped to whatever little we may have, or ever hope to have, of some kind of seedy sainthood of our own. Yeah. So All Saints' Day, it's a way of honoring these folks in our lives. And some of them may be martyrs, like you pointed out, Gail. It points to Jesus. All of them point to Jesus as the source of hope for the living and the dead. And who of us, I read that children's story, but who of us has not feared the dark, ruminated on the unknown, or wondered especially about death itself? When I was a little kid, if I was wide awake, I feared the dark when the lights went off at bedtime. I feared there might be someone or somebody hiding under the bed, gonna jump out. I think that's because my two sisters played a lot of tricks on me. And when the automatic garage door came down and hit the family cat, Mitzi, and he died, I cried. And I experienced grief. Who of us doesn't know these experiences? And then when we get to be big kids, adults, and there's more grief and loss, the specter of death looms as family members die and we think more about our own mortality. And in our society, while we cherish this life, we fear death. But praise be to God, for we as Christ followers believe that Christ's resurrection has broken death's back and that the dead will be resurrected to life. And therefore death is no longer something we fear. And these persons we've just prayed for, they may have done something very holy in our lives, or just be people who bless us with their existence, but they impact us. And the thrust of today's powerful story about Jesus raising Lazarus from the grave is really Jesus staring the world's sin in the face and seeing the decay, angrily calling out the enemy death. He's no friend of death. He's a friend of Lazarus. It's a showdown between Jesus and death. So I like Westerns, so I call it the shootout at the OK Corral. Jesus calls out death and he outguns it. Here it looks like he's too late because Lazarus has been dead, wrapped, and shut up in a tomb for 4 days. So there's 3 stages that build up to a climax of Jesus commanding the dead man to come out. And first is the challenge to Jesus' emotions. There's a lot of emotions in this. I never saw Jesus weep until this story. And second, there's the challenge of faith that goes out to Martha and Mary and to the Jews who are watching the situation take place. And last, there's the call out of Jesus, a shout of command which holds mastery over death. So we come into this story in verse 32, and it comes in where Jesus meets Mary, who she's full of sorrow, and she gushes to Jesus that if he had been there, her brother would never have died. He would not have died. Earlier in chapter 11, we had seen her sister Martha say the same thing. If you had been there, my brother would not have died. But Martha's a little bit more practical, and she's like, what are we going to do now? But Mary, she's just a mess. And what gives Jesus' arrival to the grieving scene such power is that he could have rushed to Bethany. When he got the news, he got a report, you're the one you love, Lazarus, he's sick, can you come? He could have rushed over there, like a lot of pastors do when they get a call in the middle of the night, a parishioner is sick, and we would do that. But Jesus doesn't do that. He waits. He does the opposite. He waits. Why does he do that? The Father has spoken to Jesus. Remember, Jesus said, I am the Father and the Father are one. And they were one. Whatever Jesus knew, he knew it because the Father had told him. And he's spoken to Jesus to wait, because this becomes a testimony about seeing and believing the power and the glory of God, as well as the glory of his Son, Jesus. So let's talk about how this glory dramatically builds up and plays out. The scene's full of weeping and wailing. Mary comes from the house, trailed by a group of Jews keeping watch of her every movement. I don't know if you know this, but in Jewish funeral custom, the custom dictated that even a poor family was expected to hire at least 2 flute players and a professional wailing woman. We still see this today in the Middle East, don't we? But this family wasn't poor, by the way. Mary and Martha, they weren't poor. In addition to the tears of Mary and her grieving friends, therefore, there was a lot of professional grief going on. And in the middle of this, we read that Jesus himself was moved, deeply moved in spirit and troubled. What does that mean? Well, we get help from the Greek word embrymonomai. I can't even say it. Embrymonomai. And it can refer, this is really funny, it can refer to the snorting of horses, but as applied to humans, it usually suggests anger, outrage, and emotional indignation. Inwardly, Jesus felt a rising anger toward the corruption of the world, which imposed death upon human beings like his friend Lazarus. Remember, Jesus is coming to the end. He knows, I'm going to the cross soon. He knows this. And it's like he's looking at the world saying, these people, they need to be saved. And he hates what the world is doing to them. He hates the enemy. But it wasn't the grief of the sisters or of the Jews that was pressuring him to do a miracle or arousing his wrath. At the same time, he felt anger. He could be loving at the same time. He could grieve over Jerusalem like a mother hen broods over her chicks. He could understand that his followers also hold that in one hand and understand the other hand that his followers, like the rest of humankind, were by nature objects of God's wrath. Even though in love we were predestined to be adopted as God's sons through Jesus. But here, the one who always does what pleases the Father is indignant when faced with attitudes that are not governed by the truths that the Father has revealed. If sin, illness, and death, all devastating features of our fallen world, stir up his wrath, then include one more in that, unbelief. Unbelief goes on that list. Jesus saw the world's sin grappling with the objects of God's love, and so when he was shown the tomb where the body lay, he wept. His grief was a mixture, though, of this lamenting loss of tears with tears that are feeling outrage at the sin at the same time. You know, now we can be like this too. This is kind of like something for us to learn as Christians, how to handle grief, how to handle these emotional swings, and that grief and compassion can go together. It's good for us as his people to learn that same tension, that grief and compassion without outrage reduce everything to mere sentiment, while outrage without grief hardens into self-righteous arrogance. The Jewish spectators who are there, they see Jesus' tears. Well, they see it as culturally given love and sympathy for a family in mourning, oh, see how he loves them. But some of them say, how is it that this guy who healed the blind man couldn't have prevented this man's death too? Unbelief. Yeah, perhaps what they were thinking maybe had a valid point, because they were wondering about it, but it was still unbelief. And I have to think, it's not in the text, but I have to think that because I've been in situations where people were dying or families were grieving, perhaps they were thinking what all of us feel when someone has died and we don't know what to say, that sense of powerlessness. And all you can do is say, I'm sorry for your loss, and walk away. It's a very powerless feeling. And we kind of make up things to say. But the last thing on their minds in all this is that Jesus' actions were leading up to a miracle. Even his own disciples were clueless about what was going on. They didn't expect him to raise Lazarus. So the action intensifies. Jesus asked, where have you laid Lazarus? And Martha, Mary, and the mourners go to the graveyard. And when Jesus orders the stone ceiling the cave to be removed, Martha reacts. She reacts. Remember Martha. Remember back earlier in chapter 11, he had said to Martha, he will rise again. Your brother will rise again. And she says, oh yeah, I know he'll rise on the last day of the resurrection. I believe that, teacher. And she says, I am the resurrection and the life, Jesus says. And whoever believes in me will never die. And Martha, he says to Martha, do you believe this? And she says, yes, I do. You are the Christ. You are the Son of God. I believe you are the one God sent to us. You are the one who is to come to us. But Martha now, that's back then. And she did say it. She meant it. But now she reacts, but Lord, don't open that tomb up. The smell will be awful. In the King James Version, now don't laugh, this is serious now. In the King James Version she says, Lord, by this time he stinketh, for he hath been dead for 4 days. That's what it actually says. But this is Jesus' challenge not only to emotions, but to faith, to Martha's faith. To our faith. And he tells Martha, did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see God's glory? Now, Jesus, we know, he was close friends with Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. He often went to their house and he ate. They had the best food in town, best pizza. But the purpose of him restoring Lazarus to life was not so that the family could be reunited in happiness, although Jesus could have celebrated with them in that with a lot of joy. No, it was that Martha should see the glory of God once she had believed, and that many of these Jews would likewise see the glory of God and believe. That was the purpose. The work of Jesus, God's Messiah, to cause people to believe in him, especially while there's still time and light. And before he miraculously raises Lazarus, he says a prayer. And it's a public prayer because he's saying it right out loud. He's not trying to grandstand, he's not trying to play to the crowd. He just wants his will and God's will is to see people saved, to see people believe. And so he says this public prayer, and he asks that its witnesses there may hear and believe that God sent him. And the development of Jesus' challenge to believe in him, they go back to that John chapter 11, as I said. But this is a day where people are watching Jesus. They're watching Jesus. He's a high-profile leader. He's anointed. And at the same time, everybody's talking about him everywhere because he's in the crosshairs of the Sanhedrin and all the teachers of the law who are already plotting to kill him. And he's only 2 miles away, less than 2 miles away from Jerusalem in Bethany. So this is a day, though, to believe in Jesus. It's not just a day that he did another miracle and Lazarus is back. That's great, but this is a day to focus on Jesus. He's the way, the truth, and the life. He's the resurrection and the life. I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live a new life, even though he dies, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die. And he tests her faith. Do you believe this? Do you believe this, Martha? Martha's replies, as I said, yes, she says. Jesus wanted to see and hear more of that belief. And the Jews who had just questioned Jesus why Jesus didn't prevent Lazarus' death if he'd already healed the blind man, they clearly meant that they didn't believe in him. It is the unbelief of a person whose faith does not rest on Jesus, who Jesus is, and what he has revealed of the Father. But they count on signs and wonders, but they don't see Jesus, the resurrection and the life. This unbelief is the reason the next verse reports that Jesus' quiet outrage flares up again. And Martha's objection to Jesus' request to remove the stone sealing the tomb, it's not really unbelief. We should cut her a break. There's no reason why she could have understood from her conversation with Jesus earlier that he intended to raise her brother immediately that day. How many resurrections of people were going on? Whoever heard of it? And after 4 days, let's face it would have been hard for us to think about unearthing that tomb and smelling that, and that's kind of traumatic, maybe. It was hard not to think about the stench of the decomposition of the body. So Jesus really was testing the faith. Did I not tell you that you would see the glory of God? Did I not tell you? This was a promise he was assuring her of, as from those verses in 23 to 26. This raising of life of a dead person was a revelatory act, the manifestation of the glory of God in Christ Jesus. Jesus' question should not be taken to imply that he was somehow promising that he would indeed raise Lazarus immediately, right here, back then, when he first said it to Martha, but that if Martha herself confessed Jesus as the Messiah, as the resurrection and the life, then even in the face of death, Jesus could be trusted, for he would be doing nothing other than which displays the glory of the world. So whatever Jesus would do, it was going to display the glory of the world. And he was just asking them to trust. He's consoling Mary, and they proceed to the tomb, and the fully human Jesus and the fully God Jesus are on display here. And as Jesus approaches the tomb, we learn about Jesus, not only an emotional person, he's truly affected by the reality and power of death. He empathizes with suffering. He loves people. He loves us. And I don't know about you, but Jesus' compassionate response to Mary and Martha and to Lazarus' death causes me to trust him more. I know he understands my suffering and my grief, and yet he's more than just teacher, more than rabbi. He wants us to trust him as the resurrection and the life. And his weeping, he starts to weep, and this reveals who he is as a human being. He's entered into our experiences, and he knows how we feel. The shortest verse in the Bible, what is it? Jesus wept. Very good, you've memorized that. It actually translates in Greek to Jesus burst into tears. And that assures me of his empathy. As Hebrews 4:14-16 says, he is the merciful and faithful high priest, and we may come to the throne of grace and find all the gracious help in our hour of need. We see in Jesus' tears the early signs of the glory of God being manifested. Maybe he's weeping for Lazarus and with the sister because we knew he was calling his friend. He knew he was calling his friend from heaven and back into a wicked world. Can you imagine? Lazarus is probably like, oh boy, I'm glad to be where I am. And then she says, no, come on back. Too early. You got to come back. And he's like, what? He's got to do it all over again someday. In order that God's glory may be revealed, this particular revelation of God's glory is so that God's Son may be glorified through it. That is, this raising of Lazarus provides an opportunity for God in revealing his Son, to glorify his Son. For it's the Father's express purpose that all should honor the Son, even as all honor the Father. John 17:4, we remember Jesus says he's glorified his Father by completing the works the Father assigned him to perform. The Father and the Son are mutually committed to each other's glory. The irony is that if in this miracle of restoration to life, both the Father and the Son are glorified, revealed who they are, the moment of glorification comes in Jesus' death. So now let's go, the final scene in verse 43. When Jesus calls out Lazarus, he calls out death. Lazarus, come out! We can just imagine the dead everywhere heard the voice of the Son of God and sprang to attention. There's a Puritan writer who wrote that if Jesus had not specified Lazarus, then because his authority is so great, all the tombs would have given up their dead to resurrection life. The dead man comes out. And although it must have been hard for him to walk, he's got a lot of bandaging on. This is really a Halloween story, isn't it? The dead man comes out. It must have been hard for him to walk. He's so wrapped so tightly in these linens. And Jesus, sensitive to Lazarus, orders that Lazarus' bonds be loosened. His order to remove the grave clothes and let him go speaks to us in our sinful states as the Lord delivers us from the things that bind us. Jesus conquered death. We don't have to be afraid of it. We remember and appreciate our deceased loved ones in our lives who impacted us. I made a short list of my own. One was a black man named Matthew Ayerga from Chad, who was killed after saying, I support that man over there who loves Jesus Christ. He just supported a man, so he was killed for it. Another was a Chinese woman named May, who was a good friend. She was a good friend. Of Luann and me. Died a year ago. Another is Ademir, a Brazilian pastor who died of COVID. I worked with him 20 years ago in Brazil. I think of a woman named Geraldine who was in hospice at this time last year. I companioned her at the end of her life until she went home. There was my father, there was my father-in-law, and my nephew, Billy, who at age 35 dropped dead of a heart attack. He left a wife and 3 young children. If you're at a funeral, what difference does the hope that there is a promise of eternal life make to you? A lot. I hope and I pray for you that you are confident that you will live eternally. What concerns you the most about dying? Maybe you're concerned with who will inherit your possessions when you die. For others, it's the leaving of loved ones behind. Or maybe you're wondering where you'll spend eternity. Many of us also have definite feelings on how we want to be remembered. Well, there's a lot in John 11 that can comfort and give us hope about the future. Jesus promises that believers will never die. He promises this, and he offers himself for our salvation. I am the resurrection and the life. We will see Jesus after we die. Jesus is in control of our lives right now, though. And of course, there is the joyful thought of seeing your mom and your dad and others in heaven and having a new spiritual body, just like the dragonfly. For he has driven out the fear of death and given us everlasting life. Amen.